class throughout the morning and then post it again. We're going to talk few things, a few things, and I'll have a handout for you after the first break about data. But what we want to do is talk about some of the important characteristics of data. And one of those is the idea of the center of a set of data. Remember, statistics are based on a collection of data. A set, we call that a set. And a set of data is about a specific topic, and presumably with the information, the data gathered using consistent methodology all the way through. We talked on Monday, Nate, about the decennial census in this country. This is really one of the definitive data sets that is used. The purpose of it is to reapportion representation in Congress among the states. And as a result, in my lifetime, we've seen a big change in that distribution. It used to be that the population was skewed into the north of the country and the east. Lately, it has been moving further to the south and west. And so states like Michigan and New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania have actually been losing representatives in Congress, but states in the South, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Arizona, New Mexico, and so forth, have actually been gaining representation based on the census data, which records the movement of people. So the purpose of the census originally was strictly to determine how many representatives go to Congress and to the House of Representatives, which is based on the population. As you know, the Senate is just 2 per state. But the House of Representatives is a population-based representation, so that states like California, which is the most populous state we have, and Texas, which I think is number 2, have much more representation in Congress than Colorado, which is gaining regularly, and certainly Wyoming, which struggles just to keep 1. I mean, they're guaranteed 1. So, but they have a hard time even getting past that. So that is one of the definitive statistical surveys that's done, and it's done on a population. It's done, we theoretically will make an effort to include every single human being in the country. We use it for a lot of things. I used it a number of years ago. I discovered that I could acquire a second citizenship. My grandfather was born in Ireland and immigrated to this country. And we had to be able to prove back through records, official records, that he was indeed my grandfather. I couldn't just go and say, well, he was my grandfather. He was born here in Ireland. I had to find the records. And so the census records helped me a lot. I could show when he came to the United States. I could show, that they were resident in the New York area for decades. And then I was able to use similar data, which ultimately became available online from the Republic of Ireland, to acquire his birth certificate and census records for his parents. So these are useful things, but the data collected are pretty broad. We've taken it to actually looking at other topics, other statistically relevant topics. Number of people living in households, household income, that's a voluntary thing in all cases, but average household income, births, deaths, additions, etc., We've accumulated a lot of data and more. We accumulate other demographic data, such as what faith do you affiliate with? What is we don't collect party affiliation, political party affiliation data, at least as a required part, because of course that's no one's business but your own. And people, we also don't collect other kinds of information that some people think would be useful to have, but again goes into areas where we start invading privacy. So we avoid that. So what we've done with that, that's a population. That means we're trying to survey over, when 2020 comes, we're probably going to be having to try and survey 325 million people. It's very difficult to do, and is a massive undertaking. But that's the one major nationwide survey, census, that's done on the entire population. For the most part, surveys and data are collected on a sample, which is a representative set of the defined population. Now, when we talk about population, we could do a survey of, well, I use Loveland as the example, Nate, because I live there, and so I figure I can pick on Loveland. But if we're interested in finding out various bits of information about the population of Loveland, we can either try to survey all 77,000 of us, or we can find a sample, a subpopulation that we can use as a basis for making general statements about the population. And again, when we do that, we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about a collection of individuals, where we can make these predictions. If we were to just want to know, for instance, one of the things was, attitudes about speeding in Loveland. And I say that because I see people driving like maniacs. Yeah. And 34. 34 is nuts. But so I know that this, I know people have different attitudes about this. So are you interested in so would we have to talk to every person who drives in Loveland? That would be our population. Everyone with a driver's license in Loveland. But do we have to talk to all of them? No. We can probably get a pretty good idea by taking a sample of as few as 1,000 people. But how do we identify that sample? So, pardon? That's one way of doing it. Excellent, excellent. That's one way of doing it. Several things. You could generate a random list of addresses and do that way. So that's how the object is to pick a population, to pick it in such a way that that everyone would have an equal chance of being included. So out of 77,000 people, there's probably 20,000 different addresses, let's call it that. So if you could randomly generate a list from that was throughout the entire city, then you'd be covering the entire city. Another thing you can do is split the city into like voting precincts. That's an easy one, or 10 square block areas, whatever. And pick randomly a few of those and survey everyone in them. Or you could just say, okay, here is a list, numerical and alphabetical, of every address. We're gonna target every 10th address on this list. That's a systematic method of going through, and it's fairly randomized at that point. If you set up your algorithm so that you can do that, or you may be more interested in differential attitudes between women and men drivers, or between drivers between the ages of 16 and 19 and drivers older. Or you might want to stratify it in these areas. But when you start stratifying, then you need more people, because each of your levels has to have sufficient statistical power, enough people in it to where you can draw inferences from the data. So we use these sampling techniques. So that's one of the reasons that if you see a survey, you want to know, how did you choose these people? And I am always suspicious when people don't tell you how they've made their choice. You know, if you're going to be honest and just walk down the street and stop people, and we've seen this with what Jay Leno used to just walk down the streets of New York and stop people, ask them questions. No statistical power to those, because first off, you only see the ones that are willing to talk with him, and second off, you only see the ones he's willing to broadcast. So, and some of the reasons they might not broadcast is maybe you don't want to hear the language they're using. I mean, that's one. I mean, that's legitimate. But the other is that if he's got a goal, yeah, if he's got a goal. I mean, this is one of my problems with Michael Moore and his movies. He has an agenda. It doesn't matter if what he presents is based on fact. He has an agenda. And you have to factor that in when you watch one of his movies. Okay? You may or may not agree with his agenda, but you still have to factor that in, because you don't know that he's going to include all sides of an issue. And I keep seeing this. I see this with people that that get on and are attacking one point of view. Just recently saw one had to do with gun control, and there was I don't care what anybody believes about gun control. That's not the discussion here. And it's irrelevant. Okay. But what happened there was a video that was very much pro-gun control. And there are lots of statistical studies that estimate anywhere from 70 to 90% of Americans want to see some controls. What does that mean? Nobody ever tells us what that means. Yeah. And I'll guarantee you it runs from we ought to get rid of all of them to, to something much milder, like people, even George H.W. Bush, who dropped out of the NRA over the issue of cop killer bullets. So it runs the gamut. But this person had a bunch of statistics about shootings and deaths and compared to the United States and everything. And this guy that was countering it, or trying to, was first off talking about 9,000 syllables a second, so fast. And he was mocking the person. I always get suspicious. If you have to mock someone, you've already lost the argument with me. Because if you can't defend it logically, don't try to use emotional stuff. That's what was going on. But he was mocking the person, and then he was throwing out numbers with no support of his own. And this happens on every side of every issue. I don't care what you believe about any issue. When people start ranting like this and start throwing out numbers, your first reaction should be, where are you getting the numbers? What is your bias? Okay. But where are you getting the numbers? I'm perfectly willing to be wrong on an issue if you can show me that I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I will change my mind. And I'm willing to do that. But if you're just going to throw a bunch of numbers at me and expect me to just say, oh, well, that sounds great. Yeah, right. Ain't going to happen. Because I've just seen too much of this over the years. And reality is much more complex than a bunch of random numbers thrown out. But I see people do this. And what happens is you don't know how they collect their data. You don't know what the sample's based on. You don't know anything about it other than the guy's opinion. And part of the problem is one of my goals with this class is, if nothing else, to make you suspicious of anything that people say that involves claims to be based on statistical analysis, okay, and how it's done. I don't care whether you believe it or not. I mean, it really ought to be, if you need to be able to me, you have to demonstrate that you know that you're using real data and it's as unbiased as possible. The American people can make up their minds if they have the right information. And the problem is political discourse has become propaganda. And propaganda is basically throwing out stuff without support and trying the emotional. But okay, in any set of data, so a set of data is collected by some statistically valid means. The subjects chosen to generate that data should be randomly chosen in some way, such that we have a reasonable expectation that this can be a representative sample of a population. The data set consists of whatever your information is. Now remember, the information can be qualitative, names, dates, places, or it can be quantitative. You know, we spend $603 every quarter on food in our house. I mean, I'm throwing that number out. I have no idea. But, you know, that's a quantitative value. It's supportable. We can produce receipts for it if we have to prove it. Okay. So there are lots of different ways. And the way we treat data need to be looked at as well. There's a number of the definitions and slides, Nate, from Monday talk about the kinds of data that we can acquire. But broadly speaking, we're going to be dealing with quantitative data in this class. Some qualitative. But every set of data spans a range of whatever the variable is. Okay, let's just talk about, we're going to talk about blood pressure today as one set of examples. The range of data is going to be whatever our data set is, not the population as a whole, but in our data set. And we have the concept of what is the center of the data set. And there are several different ways of determining center. One of them is simply take the average. We call that the mean. And all you do is add up the numbers and divide by the total number of samples. And that's your average. Another measure of the center is what we call the median. And a median is, if you line up the data in order, you go to the center point of that list. That's the median. What's the difference between the median and the mean? Well, let's just look at one example that the text uses, I believe, is salaries of college football coaches. Salaries of college football coaches range anywhere from about $50,000 a year at a small school in the middle of nowhere to a place like Michigan State or Alabama, where it might be $3 million a year. But the vast majority are going to be at the lower end of that scale. So that $3 million a year at 2 or 3 different schools is going to pull the average up, but the median number is not going to shift very far. It's not going to shift at all. It's still the very center of the data set. So where you have a smooth distribution of data, the average works, the mean works. But where you have what we call outliers, very, very high or very low numbers, the median is a better measure of the center of a data set. Another method is something we call the mode. And the mode is to look at the most common value. When we look at the data set of blood pressures in a little while, we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes. We'll see that several people had very similar blood pressure, the same blood pressure. So what we do is we are looking for those values that have the most occurrence. That's another measure sort of the center. And then we look at the variation, which is basically how the data changes. And we'll run into the concept of the standard deviation, which is a measure of how far something is from that center point of the data. And we have lots of ways of calculating that. We'll look at distribution. I mean, we talk a lot about the bell curve, which is really a smooth shape that looks like an inverted bell. Most data, a large enough data set has a better chance of falling into a bell-shaped curve than a small data set. So they can be skewed toward one end or the other. Where we have lots of outliers, it's going to skew the shape of the data set. Then another thing we might look at is changing characteristics over time. So let's take a short break, take about a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and talk about presentation data further. All right. So once again, we'll.
Can you hear this on Zoom?
Yes. What's going on? Okay. Then hold. We'd prefer not. For sure. Then let me give you.
Yeah, I'll follow along.
Okay. And chapter 2 homework. Give you a copy of. Now, some of these homework assignments are pretty long, but the questions in the data set are pretty big. So they take up a lot of room on the page. Some pages will have a single question. So don't get daunted by getting 10 pages. You're not going to have, in this particular one, there are 20 questions and 12 pages. Okay. But it's because I have to use a lot of data. And that's what statistics is about. There's a copy of the chapter 2 homework for you. All right. Thank you. The way we'll be going the rest of the class, what I will do is do some writing on the board. I will turn things around and try to record whatever I put on the board. And we'll see what we can do about getting things arranged here and getting a lot of data. Let me see if do you think you might actually try to come in when you get home? Let me see if I can send you a link. Yeah, good. I don't either want you to. Let me send. Yeah. Okay. See how I can invite you to this meeting here. Let me work on that for a moment, Nate. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, well, I hope you feel better. That might not be as easy as I thought. Okay. That should be, I hope, being recorded. We'll have to see. I may have to talk to somebody about how I can get him in the class. Probably Anthony when he comes in. Okay, so let's talk about how we present data. I've got a couple of handouts. One is a basic how to do a survey. This is something for you to read later. And then this one is more, it starts off talking about analog and digital, but really the value of that particular handout is the different approaches to presentation of data. And let's talk about how we present data next. The second question. We want to look at another thing to the is a bit of raw data for pulse rate in women and men. We use this as an approach that we can be monitored for how can be used, the kinds of data presentations that we can put together. This is an example of raw data. You'll note that there's no particular order here. It's not ordered by number or anything else. But let's take a look at a couple of different parameters. First off, if we do the mean, remember the mean is to average to take a total all the data and divide it by the number of samples. So it's what we usually call an average, except that the term average has too many other meanings. Statistically, we use the term mean all the time. And we find that the mean for women in this data set, now remember, it's restricted to this data set. If we're trying to take this to the wider population, a couple of things go on, one of which is we may need more data. And the other is that we have to be careful that we have properly collected this data, and that it makes sense to try and project it into the population as a whole. But in the data set, the mean for women is 76.3 pulse beats per minute, and for men, 69.4. So we're seeing a difference. Is that difference statistically significant? Hard to know. Okay. The median, remember the midpoint, if we take this data and we line it up from the smallest number to the largest for each data set, the median for women becomes 74 and for men 66. So again, there's a difference. Richard. We'll come to that. Okay. Standard deviation is a measure of how far from the center of the data set a specific measurement might be. So the standard deviation of 12.5 for women and 11.3 for men is a parameter we're going to get to later on in the class for a lot of purposes. So we look at minimum and maximum data. Okay. Again, this minimum, first quartile, third quartile, maximum is simply lining up the data in numerical order. Minimum obviously is 60 for women. And if we look down the list, we don't see anything less than 60 on the list for women. First quartile means 1/4 through the list, 25%. So at the first quartile of the data is 68. The mean or the median is actually the second quartile, because we're just going down the list. So the median now is 74. The third quartile, 3/4 of the way down the list, for women is 80. And then the maximum is 124. We take a look at the sort of rough value of the differences between these various levels. We have a minimum of 60. The first quartile goes up to 68. So in the first quartile, the numbers have risen by 8. The second quartile, the median, 74, it's risen by 6 over the first quartile. Third quartile, 80, is 6 more than the median or the middle quartile. And then the maximum is 124. So what we're seeing a data set that has outliers. Okay. When the median is 74 and the minimum is 60, but the maximum is 124, and we see these quartile levels, we know that we're going to have some outliers. And if we look down at the list, we've got 2 that are quite high, 104 and 124. So my question would be, have we collected these data under similar circumstances? Do the 104 and 124 are these women who have just come back from the gym? Or maybe gone and jogged around the block pushing the baby carriage or something. You know, we have a couple of neighbors who do that. And I think, well, that's great. Get you out, get your kid out and get you some exercise. But they obviously are that. So what we're looking at is some outliers, some data that would mean that the mean, which is why the mean is above the median. If you had a uniform data set, the mean and the median would be very, very close to each other. Okay? If we were rolling dice and we rolled enough dice, the number of times that we rolled a 7, a pair of dice, rolled a 7, total of 7 on the 2 dice, would be right in the middle of our distribution. And if we did this, say 1,000 times, we'd have a pretty uniform distribution. There'd be no outliers. Obviously, you cannot, rolling 2 dice, you can't get an 18. So that's not a great example. But with people, if we were to plot this pulse rate data, obviously some people are much higher, much lower than others. Professional athletes tend to have a resting pulse that's slower than the norm. This is probably because, as professional athletes, they have a very efficient heart. Their blood pressure is also going to be higher because one of the things that we look at with blood pressure is how often the heart has to beat to circulate blood. If it only beats, say, 50 beats a minute, it's going to be pushing harder to get that blood flowing, to get sufficient oxygen to the tissues, because they're used to this constant moving. Basketball players are some of the, basically basketball, when you're playing basketball, you're always on the move. Or soccer. Football, baseball, no. But when you're on a sport like that, or bicycle, competition cyclists and swimmers will have slower heartbeats because when the heart, when they're actually in competition, they don't want their heart beating too fast because then it starts getting out of rhythm. And they have a nasty habit of dying at that point. So what we want to see is how the data were collected. If this is just women who have been maybe brought into a clinic and been sat down for 20 minutes of just rest before taking this pulse rate, that's going to be different than just randomly taking everybody who walks in the door, because you'll have the people that are running late and they're running to the elevator and they're running down the hallway or running up the stairs if they happen to be people that prefer stairs to elevators. Their heart rate's going to be faster. Okay, so I would look at this. Is this within normal variation? Probably. There are probably women who have much higher heart rates. Look at the men. The minimum and maximum are the minimum is a little lower at 56. The maximum is significantly lower at 96. And the differences between the quartiles are much narrower. Okay, overall, you can't draw a whole lot of conclusions from those data. However, so we're going to look at how we can look at these various forms of data by going through our by going through how we can present the data. Just taking data like this, there's several ways. We can simply plot out each number on an XY graph. Remember, when we are putting things on a graph, we use an x-axis and a y-axis. The x-axis, generally speaking, is the value, or the is a number, and the number would be subject 1, subject 2, subject 3. The y-axis would be the value that you're measuring. So generally speaking, there are several other bits of information that make me look at this study and ask questions. What are the age ranges of these people? Does our heart run at the same rate all our lives? Probably not. So what are the age ranges? Okay. So again, you need to know, you need to look at any study and ask some questions about it. Okay. So let's look at a frequency table. And a frequency table basically groups the data into what we call classes. And the frequency data, in this case, the classes for looking at something that is, remember, with something like a pulse rate, this is continuous data. Actually, it's discrete data because you can't have half a beat or a third of a beat per minute. I mean, theoretically you could, but we can't measure that easily. But there's also, remember the format here is that we don't have a 0 point, because zero pulse, of course, is a corpse. So we don't have a 0 point from this. We can, however, order the data. We can put it into an order. And we do that. Again, this is raw data. So if we take a look at this and put it into an order, what we find is that we have groups. And in this particular case, if we group this as frequency or the number of subjects whose pulse is in a certain range. In the case, we're going to take basically 10 beat per minute ranges. Now, our minimum is 60, so we don't have to start with 60 or with 50 or 0 or anything. So our frequency, what we're doing is we're looking at frequency distribution tells us, again, a good idea as to where the center of the data may lie. Okay, again, center is either mean or median. Mode tells us how often the same value occurs, and we have that with a lot of data. So let's take a look at looking at frequency of this data. And if we look at this, the PowerPoint that we have, we find that there are 12 of these with a pulse rate between 60 and 69. Okay, we find 14 with a pulse rate between 70 and 79, and 11 between 80 and 89. Okay, then we get to our less frequent values, and these turn out to be a good measure of outliers. A good idea as to what outliers. We got one between 90 and 99, one between 100 and 109, none between 110 and 119, and one above 120, 120 to 129. We stop there because we don't have any higher values. So we can plot this out as well. But this tells us a couple of things. We've got 12, 26, 37, 38, 39, 40. We've got 40 values in total. So if we can plot this out. Let me just see. Let's have some definitions. The lower limit of each class would be whatever we establish. In this case, 60, 70, 80, etc. The upper limits, of course, is going to be 69, 79, etc. But what we want to do is look at the boundaries. The boundaries are midway, a value that's midway between the upper value of one class and the lower value of the next class. So the boundary values are before the lower rate class of 60 to 69, it's 59.5, because we've established that if there were a lower class, it would be 50 to 59. So it's midway between. So the next one, midway between 69 and 70, is 69.5. So we have a boundary, which is the midpoint between the upper of one class and the lower of another. Notice that we can't have 60 to 69, 69 to 79, because we're going to double count our data potentially. So boundaries are exclusive. Classes are exclusive, meaning they do not, there's no overlap. Okay, midpoints, obviously, what we do is we add the lower and upper and divide by 2, a true average. So the midpoints then are 64.5, 74.5, etc. That's how we define a midpoint. Why do we care about that? Because we are looking at how we present our data. Okay, the width. We prefer to have our class width to be the same for every between each class. Otherwise, again, we're skewing the data and the presentation. So our class width has to be static. Okay, so again, it's the difference between the upper limit of one class and the upper limit of the next. So we've got the difference between 69 and 70 and 79 is 10, etc., all the way down through the list. So the class width must be uniform for this to be useful. Why would we use this instead of just plotting all the data? 40 data points is not that many. But it's useful in large data sets, and when we can expect to have multiple occurrences of one value, which we would expect in things like pulse rate or blood pressure rate, or maybe the speed with which drivers are going down Taft Hill Road in Fort Collins, or whatever. We can look at grouping the data in ways that make analysis a little easier to handle. So how do we determine the number of classes in a set? Guidelines are between 5 and 20 classes. More than that, and we have a very cumbersome looking analysis. Class width, okay? So what we do is we look at the minimum and maximum value and divide by the number of classes that we've constructed. So the minimum the minimum class is our minimum and maximum. We've got for women, we've got 60 and 124. Add that up to pardon? Yeah, excuse me, subtract them. 124 minus 60 is 64. We've determined that our number of classes is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 classes. Okay. And we divide 64 by 7 and round up always. Okay. And we come up with our class width. Why do we round up? Well, that's just that's the standard methodology we use so that we don't have we don't have classes that are too narrow. Makes it a lot easier. So our minimum class size, our minimum starting point is either the minimum data value or a convenient value below that minimum that allows us to construct our class levels. In this case, 60 is our minimum. So it's easy to start at 60 if we're using a class width of 10. If we were using a class width of say 5, which is perfectly legit, we'd still start at 60 because that's still our minimum. But we'd end at 125 instead of 130. Okay. So, and then we just list those limits. Okay. So, pardon? Yeah. Oh, approximately. No, it doesn't. In fact, we round it up because it won't. It'll be rare that it will come out a nice even number. And we might look at it and say, well, this is really 11, but that's a cumbersome number, so let's round it back to 10. We want our class width to be a convenient number and make it easy to deal with our data. But if we had, say, 1,000 data points in here, we might decide that we wanted to have it grouped in class width of 5. But we don't. We have only 40. 40 is not a very big data set. I mean, for might look like it, but it's not. It's not really a big data set. So we want to look at a couple of other things. The relative distribution, okay, is a proportion. Okay, so let's look at how we would calculate that in this. We have a total frequency of 40. Frequency basically is the number of data points we have. So the relative frequency in the first class, 60 to 69, is 12 out of 40, which is 0.3. 12 40ths is 0.3, 30%. So distribution frequency. So now we're saying we can construct this table and we can say, well, 30% of our data lies in this first class, 60 to 69. And 35% is between 70 and 79. And 27.5% is between 80 and 89. This is how we can scale this up to a larger population. If we had, say, let's just say we had, instead of 40 data points, which is, as I say, is not very many, we cannot take this and generalize these numbers. We can't say that because of our 40 data points, if we looked at all the women in Fort Collins, that 30% of their pulse rates would be between 60 and 69 under the conditions we measured here. But if this were the result of 1,000 measurements, it might have enough statistical validity that we could say 30%, but we'd have to qualify that, approximately 30%. Because what happens if it's 30.5? Is that a significant difference? Well, no, but nonetheless, we need to be careful that we understand that all of these numbers, frequency distributions and stuff, unless you have done an entire population, the frequency distribution is always an approximation. Now, the bigger the sample, the less approximate it becomes. But that's something also to remember. Cumulative, we can add this up. If we look at, we can say that if 12 are between 60 and 69, then we have 12 subjects that are less than 70. If we keep going up the list and we're adding up everyone that is below where that's where the class is and the lower classes. So we have 26 out of our 40 that are less than 80, and 37 out of 40, or more than 90%, are less than 90. Now we're starting to get to an area where we can start making some conclusions, again, if our data set is large enough, that we can start saying that we can expect 90% of our patients to have a pulse rate of less than 90 beats per minute, for whatever purpose that might serve you. We can also look at the cumulative frequency. We've looked at the relative frequency, the cumulative frequency rates, the cumulative of the relative frequencies, the percentage frequencies, must add up to 100. Because at 100, you've had all of your samples. That's another thing to remember, that when people start throwing statistics out, you need to know not just what statistic they're quoting to you, but what the rest of the data were. And those statistics have those frequencies, the percentage of distribution must add up to 100% of the sample. Okay. Okay. So looking at frequency distributions, again, that's one of the points, is that all of those frequency distributions must add up to 100% of the data set. If they don't, and I don't mean that mathematically you end up with 99.9%, or in terms of relative frequencies, or 100.1%. Those are rounding differences, and those are irrelevant. Okay, but I mean, if people are quoting a bunch of numbers at you and you add them up and you get only 90% of the data set, what's happened to the other 10? As a statistical skeptic, I always want to know where they're coming from and what they've omitted, because that's a problem that people who are tempted to do. Sometimes it's absolutely inadvertent, because somebody will say, well, those other subjects were not relevant, or they were bad measurements or something. But in reality, when you exclude a data point from an analysis, you'd better have a reason for it. There is a movement in medicine to what we've spent a lot of time is looking at what is abnormal, especially in psychology and psychiatry. We spend a lot of time talking about what is abnormal. So we're talking about the people that fall outside of whatever we've defined as normal. And we forget that there is a reason that most people fall into the normal range. So why are these people normal and these other people not? And what are our definitions? So again, we are looking at data, and we have to remember that, especially in medicine, data is people. Okay, so we're going to talk later on about normal distribution, which is that standard bell curve you've all seen. Okay. which happens a lot. And over very large data sets, most things will eventually coalesce into that normal distribution, but smaller data sets don't necessarily. Hey, Dan.
I started interrupting. You know what's that name now? With the Zoom ID? Or do we not have Zoom capabilities?
I have it. I'm going to wait until Anthony gets here and figure out how I can get him onto what I've just started as a recording.
Cool.
So as soon as Anthony's here, I'm going to make an effort at it, and then
Cool.
I'll let him know.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Dan. So, we have gaps in data. Note that we had part of our frequency distribution. There was one class that had 0 frequency in it. So is that a gap in the data? Well, it's a gap in the data collected, and it may or may not be meaningful. And again, it's probably because of sample size. We have only 40 data points. If we had 400 data points, my bet is we would have had some people in that 110 to 120 range. But the thing about gaps is it can indicate that we have different populations. Okay. And by different populations, I mean that it may be that we have people from different different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of activities. As I said, the people with the very high pulse rates are these people that have just come out of the gym. We don't know from this data. All we're presented with is it's women. We don't know what other parameters were used. Okay, we're going to talk about histograms, and we can use, this is one of our presentation modalities, but right now we should be on break. So let's take our second break, and I'll see what I can find out about how to get Nate online. We'll resume the recording. Okay. Okay, we're back on. I hope that, let me just quickly actually do this. Okay. All right, so we should still be active. Find this out later. All right. So what I'm going to do now is actually see if I can't do some things on the board. And hopefully help. What I'm going to do is so that I don't give anybody And we'll see if this works. So there's a couple of ways of presenting data. We've got, I want to talk about histograms and gonna stop the share. Great. Raise that up. Actually, that's going to work, I hope. Okay. So I want to talk about ways of looking at data and what kind of one form of plot, one form of graphical presentation is called a histogram. And basically, what we do is we create a bar that has our number. So what we first off want to do is actually set up how it's going to be done. Again, this is a frequency histogram. So we use an XY graph, and we have frequency. And this comes out of the data that we looked at before of absolute numbers of appearances of the data. So we set up a scale. We know that the largest number on our scale was 14. And the lowest number was 0. So we have 0, 5, 10, and 15 are our y-axis. And our x-axis is actually the boundaries of our frequency data. So remember, the first boundary was 59.5. The second boundary was 69.5, 79.5, 89.5, 99.5, 109.5, 119.5, and 129.5. And so what we do is we just have basically a bar that's connected. In a histogram, all the bars are connected. So the first frequency was 12. So our first bar is 12. Our second frequency was 14. So our second bar is 14. Our third was 11. Okay. And then we had 1, 1, 0. So we just leave it blank. And 1. So that's what our histogram, our frequency. And remember, frequency is merely the number of data points that appear in that area of the plot, right? We can also do this with our frequency distribution of our relative frequency. We just changed the scale. Remember, that was a percentage scale. And the percents went up to 35%. So we can also plot the same data as relative frequency. We just change what the scale is. We have 0, 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%. We just change what the percentages are in those cases. So all we've done, we're presenting exactly the same data. It looks exactly the same. It's just that we've asked ourselves, what's important, the numerical frequency or the relative frequency? Okay. Now, the other thing is that maintaining, there's something called a frequency polygon, which is often used, which is basically we retain the we retain the data, we retain the frequency scale, but we change to our boundary conditions are the midpoints of our data. So let's erase all of these, all of the big bars. And we'll erase the boundaries and we replace it with the midpoint. First midpoint is 64.5, 74.5, 84.5, 94.5, 104.5, 114.5, and 124.5. And all we do is place, we have none below the first class. That is that the center point is 64.5. So our first data point is 0. So our data point at the midpoint of the first class becomes 12, and then 14, and then 11, and then it falls to 1, 1, 0, and 1. And so what we do is we just connect the dots. And make a plot that looks like that. And then there's no data out further, so we go to a putative 134.5. We go one class beyond where we stopped and put that at 0 because there's no data there. Okay, and we want to be sure that we've shown that there's nothing below the 60 because there was nothing below that level. So our polygon has to start and stop at 0. Okay, that doesn't mean it can't have a 0 in the middle. It does. We had one class that had no entries. Other ways of looking at the data, we can also plot that in terms of the relative frequency, but again, using the same scale, the same x-axis, and just changing to percentages for the y-axis. But we can do the same thing. We can also use these kinds of plots to compare the data for men and women. But we need to find a way to differentiate. When we have the ability to present things in color, it's easy to put one set of data in one color, one set of data in another. Or what we often do is if we don't have that, we'll have one set of data that's on a solid line, and maybe the second set is in a dashed line. Something that we can use to show a difference. So again, this is a way of showing the data. The reason we use plots on our data, and we use different kinds of plots, is really for one purpose, and that is that a large number of numbers are incomprehensible to most people. Also, it's exhausting. You have to look at it. What we've done with our frequency plot is we've presented the data in a form that's visual. It's real obvious from the frequency plot how the data were distributed. It also is real obvious that we have an outline, as I said before. That's not so obvious from just looking at a table of numbers. And this is why we mostly want to present this in terms of looking at all of our data. We want to present the data in a graphical form so that people can have a visual reference. And most of us do better visually than in trying to understand a whole line of numbers. Not that there's anything wrong with numbers, they're the basis for what we've done. And some people are better at looking at numbers and drawing conclusions than others, but almost all of us can get a much quicker quicker grasp of what the data are saying if it's plotted out. Sort of like the stock market data. You see a bunch of numbers for the closing, say, the closing stock market value at the end of each week. Say, so you got so in a year you'd have 52 numbers, and if it were just put down in date order, those numbers are going to go all over the place. So, when you plot it out, then you get a better idea of where the variation is, but you can also see that there are trends. And that's what we look at a lot of times, especially economic data. We look at trends. Okay, there's another form called an ogive, O-G-I-V-E, which really looks at the cumulative data. We'll get this off of here again. And remember, our cumulative data is going to be essentially the addition of all of the frequency data as we go up the graph, the total number of data points. So now our frequency graph line has to change. So because it has to add up to the total number of data points. So we have 40 data points. So our scale has to go up to 40. Okay. Since we're looking at cumulative frequencies, we're going to go back to the boundaries as our scale on the x-axis. In other words, our first boundary is at 59.5, 69.5, 79.5, etc. Obviously, 0 at the first boundary. There were none below 60. So in the 60s, there were 12. So we have our first data point. In the 70s, there were 14, right? So now we've gone to 26. Okay. So our 70s takes us up to 26. We connect it up. We've got 11 more in the 90s. So that's going to take us to 37. And then we're going to add 1 for each of the next 2, and then none for the third, and then 1 more for the last. So our basically it's the cumulative frequency. So what we're seeing again is the slope. Remember the slope from algebra is the rise over the run. A steeper slope is a faster rise. What we're seeing is that most of the data here again occurs in the area below 80. And then it flattens out. And again, if we had 1,000 women in this study, this curve would look a little different because we expect to see a few more, besides the fact that the scale would change on the line. We expect to see a few more data points in those upper ranges, in the upper classes. But still, we'd expect from the look of this data, I would expect that if we had 1,000 people, we still see our sharpest, our highest frequency would be in those first 2 classes. We may have a fourth type. We may have find some women that focus below 6. In fact, chances are pretty good that we would. So we may have more classes to deal with. We may have some people whose pulses go above 130. Okay. But probably not very many because we're then approaching other medical problems. Let's go to something else. It's called dot plot. A dot plot is another visual means of looking at the data. Basically, a dot plot is just that. You put down a dot for every single data point. Okay. So we'll call this a dot plot. And here we have an x-axis, but no, not necessarily a y-axis. And we're looking at the actual data values. So we have data at 60. We have data at 64. So we're going to make this a uniform distribution that takes us all the way out to 125. Okay, so we're going to create this line. Again, this is another way of looking at how the data are distributed in a different way. So we put a dot for each one. So we had 3 values on the table. You can go back and check me on this, but there are 3 values on the table that are 60. There are 4 values that are 64. There are 5 values that are 68. And there are 8 values that are 72. There are 6 values that are, no, there are 6 values that are 76. And there are 6 values that are 80. Then we jump to 88, where there are 5. And then 96, there's 1, 104, there's 1, and 124, there's 1. So our plot begins to look like this. And again, it gives us a visual of how the data are distributed. We can do this several ways. Most of the time when we start putting our data together, we're going to put it into an Excel spreadsheet. And we all know that it's easy to take an Excel spreadsheet and sort by numerical order. So we can actually do it that way. Use the data also to generate really a nice little tool, but you need to understand what they mean. So we've got this scattering of data that that tells us more about how often we see a specific data. Note that there's no one in there between 61, 2, 3, or 4. We've gone, or 1, 2, 3 rather. We've gone from 60 to 64. Again, this is probably an artifact of the size of the data set. This is where a gap tells us not that there are no women in the 61, 2, or 3 range, but only that there were none in this limited sample. We would expect, quite frankly, If we did 1,000 women, see significant numbers of women that would fill in all of these gaps, except possibly some at the very high range or low range. We may find that there are women who have pulses in the 40s. I'm thinking about bicycle or swimmers or gymnasts who would have lower heart rate and their physical activity. But nonetheless, we expect to see in this mid-range anywhere from 60 to 90, we expect to see continuous data. In other words, data for everyone. So we're not really worried in a small sample about so-called gaps in the data. That's an indicator to me. There's another kind of plot that is a bit confusing to people, and that is called the stem plot, or stem and leaf. And since you'll have to work with these, I want to talk about them a little bit. So what does this mean, stem and leaf? Think about plants that you may have in your yard or in the park or whatever. Where do the leaves lie? The leaves don't just come straight off the branches for the most part. They come off a stem that's on the branch. And there are rarely just one leaf on a stem. Usually there are several. You can usually differentiate different species of tree by the number of leaves that on average appear on each stem. So a stem contains, if we have a stem, we might have a leaf. We might have that many leaves, say 9 leaves on a stem. Okay, so what's the relationship here? Well, the stem is the first digit of the data set. Or, depending on the kind of data set, it may be the first 100 or the first 10 or something like that. But what it amounts to is that what we do is we look at the number, and each leaf represents a digit within that factor of 10. And so what we have is, if we look at our stems, we have data in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s, 110s, and 120s. And so our stem is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So what that says is that we're going to have a listing for everything that is in the 60s, 70s, etc. Well, in the 60s, we had 3 60s, so we represent leaves. We represent those by giving a 0 for each one. That doesn't mean there's no data. That means that there are 3 values of 60. There are 4 values of 64, so we put down 4 4s. And there are 5 values of 68, so we put down 5 eighths. Okay. In the 70s, we have 8 values of 72. So we put down 8 twos. And we have 6 values of 76. Now, what we want to do is go back and check and make sure that from our frequency plot, we have the right number of data points. Remember, there were 12 in the 60s. So if we count that up, we've got 12 leaves. There were 14 in the 70s, so we count that up. 14, we'll call them leaves. In the 80s, there were 6 that were 80, so we write down 6 zeros, and there were 5 88s. And again, we want to check back and say, okay, we had 11 data points in the 80s, so we have 11 leaves here. Now, in the 90s, we had 1 data point, and that was a 6. In the hundreds, we had a data point that was 104. In the 110s, there were no data points. We don't put anything there. We don't say 0 or anything else. We don't put anything there. And in the 120s, we had 1 data point at 124. So all we've done is listed out the data in a slightly different way. We're still seeing that we have a bunch of data in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and very little. Remember that each of these data points is simply the value. It doesn't say there were 6 data points in the 90s. It says there's 1. So it's a different way of looking at frequency. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? These are different ways of looking at the data. They each have their value. And depending on what you're going to do, you'll have some problems where you'll do stem and leaf plots. Quite frankly, I've never done a problem other than in a statistics with a stem and leaf plot. Now, that doesn't say anything about the value of that because they do have their place. And it really is in, again, when you look at the frequency distribution as a histogram or as a polygon, all you've got is a number of data points in a flat. The stem and leaf tells you exactly how the data points are distributed in that flat. So obviously here we have a gap between 60 and 64, no data point. Between 64 and 68, no data point. Between 68 and 72, no data point. So one question you would ask is, why is there a gap? And in this case, since there is no reason to think that in a broad sample of women, we wouldn't have people at every single possible value of the pulse rate, it has to be related to sample size. There is no reason to believe that women aren't going to have a pulse of, say, 75, just because we didn't measure one in our sample size. So that tells us a bit about our sample size. But we're looking and wondering if we have a good data set, and we can't think of any reason that it shouldn't have, a complete set of values like this. Would be the same for measuring blood pressure or doing large numbers of average cell counts in blood work, or measuring sales on any one day in a business. We wouldn't expect to find gaps except when the store is closed when there were no sales. So we would have to say, okay, we just don't have the data. And it tells us a bit about, how much more data we may need to actually establish. Statistics should never be just done for the fun of doing statistics. I mean, statisticians might argue with me on that, but nonetheless, most statisticians understand that the purpose is to give us information we need to either learn about populations or make business decisions. Okay, so any of these things should have a purpose. Otherwise, it's just collecting data for the simple joy of collecting data. Now, maybe that's fine with a lot of people, and maybe not. But nonetheless, we have a lot of data that we can look at that. Okay? So, let me go back to sharing. Share screen. Okay. Into eyes. All right, so I've gone back to sharing the screen. So turn this around without being one with. Okay. So we've talked about histograms and other means of looking at data. And okay. Again, there's a part of your chapter that talks about interpreting histograms. One of the biggest issues in statistics is to try and overinterpret your data. The purpose of doing statistics is to find out what data mean. But when we overinterpret it, then we have moved past finding out what the data mean to trying to figure out why something exists. Here on slide number 32 of the PowerPoint, we have a histogram. We have they're just calling it sample value. We have no idea what this is. This is just a distribution of data, and a histogram just tells us that in this. They haven't even well defined the range here. They have gone and provided us with a bunch of bars that just tell us that something in this range of about 63 to 60, 62 to 64, whatever this is, that seems to be the most frequent part of the data. That's all it's telling us. We have no idea what this is. We have no idea what this means. So we want to be careful about over-interpreting our data. Let's look at others. We used, we did the frequency polygon and the relative frequency polygon and the ogive for the confusion, and then the dot plot and stem and leaf plot. Bar graphs, probably one of the more common things we see, bar graphs. And what they often are doing, what they often use is, again, to present certain data. In this particular one on slide 42 of your PowerPoint, we're looking at median income of males and females by decade, 1950, 60, 70, 80, 90, and the year 2000. And so what we're looking at is a differential. We're seeing that there is clearly a disparity between the median income of males and females. There is so much data missing from this that it's unbelievable. Are these all median income of males employed outside the family and women employed outside the family? Because if we look at just income, women who stay home and raise the kids often have no income. But any of you who have kids know that it's not work. I mean, it is work. You are working hard. You are earning something. So, the issue here is where's the data coming from? I'm going to assume that this is women working outside the home. And there's clearly a disparity. But there's another aspect here too. We've got some rough numbers here, 5, 10, 15, et cetera, $20,000 per year. In 2000, it looks like the median, again, this is median. Remember, this is the middle of the data set. It's not the average. So what we've done is eliminate the CEO effect, meaning the guy that's making $5 million a year to sit in an office, right? As opposed to the people working down on the shop floor, right? So we've tried to eliminate or minimize that outlier effect. So it looks like in 2000, the median income for men was about $28,000 a year. The median income for women it looks to be about $17,000. So 17 to 28, that's $11,000 a year more. Okay, what we don't see here, and if we look down at 1950, it looks like the median income for women was, $1,000 or $1,500, and for men it was about $3,000. So what we really want to know in looking at this data is, again, to understand the data, it would be nice to know what is the percentage difference. Because it's clear that there's a big dollar difference, but the percentage difference in 1950 was quite a bit bigger. This could be reflective of two things. And one of them is that in 1950, a lot fewer women were working outside the home. So the data set is smaller. Is that meaningful? I don't know. I mean, if the data set is smaller, but we're still looking at 1 million data points, that's a different issue. But in 2000, we know that many women are working outside the home, even when they have kids. The differential here of, my guess, is about $11,000 out of, depends on where you want to start. 11 out of 17 is going to be, just pull out the calculator here and divide 11 by 17, and we get that women are making about 65% of what the men were. Another way of looking at that is, I thought this was 28, is that men were making 65% more than women. Now that's even though it's the same number, women making 65% of what men were making and men making 65% more, that's a mathematical artifact. It's not just something that happened, because clearly it depends on which side you're looking. Okay. And if we look at another factor, women making 65% of what men make, many of the women are going to be single mothers, sole source of income. So what's their lifestyle like compared to the family where they got a guy making 65% more? Quite different, right? So again, what's the purpose of this? This is nice information, maybe, but what are we going to do with it? And I've just given you several ways of looking at the data. And without trying to really draw any conclusions on it. What we call a Pareto chart or a Pareto chart actually is more interesting, is more useful in looking at qualitative than quantitative data. And all we've done with this is we always start with the data with the highest frequency on the left, and we go down to descending frequency. And in this particular case, it's hard to know exactly what this is, but I would guess from the categories: networking, newspaper ad, internet, application in person. This is how people either got job leads or jobs. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that 60% got either the lead or the job through networking. Well, we know that networking is the best way to get a job. Okay, we've always known that. We teach that in CSS 299. Newspaper ads. Well, obviously this is old data. Internet, next. Applications in person, employment agency, or through their school. Okay. If we did this data today, this might look a little different, but the idea here is that we've plotted this and we're looking at, if you were in the job market and you saw this, you'd say, well, I better start networking. That gives me about 4 times the next best method of finding a job, 4 times the probability of getting that job. Okay, so that would be useful there. Pie charts are one of our most favorites. Same information. But pie charts, we love our pie charts because if we talk about looking at ways of getting information, that is the most visually impactful, a pie chart is probably it. Because we know that the pie is a whole. And we look at this and we see that networking here is way more than half the pie. Well, we saw in the Pareto that it was 60%. We may not estimate this at 60%, but it's real obvious that that's the way to go. And again, our pie chart starts and goes from either clockwise or counterclockwise, from the highest frequency to the lowest. All right, let's take another break. Zoom the recording. We've got about 45 minutes left for class. So pie charts are really an excellent way of displaying quantitative data. You can also display qualitative data. If to go back to the idea of finding out, surveying every student at College America to see what their favorite color is, could easily be done in a pie chart. Because all we're doing is displaying frequency data here. But it's a good way to do it. And again, pie charts are one of the most common, but we do have to be careful that we rigorously apply the principles of making certain that we don't mislead. We can mislead with a lot of things. I like contrasting colors, because especially if it's really well contrasted throughout, then there's no misleading information or no implication of something being more important than something else. People will gravitate on a color pie chart. They will gravitate to their favorite color, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. So you can get away with that by having patterns, blanks, just an empty, no pattern at all, and lines and grids and a number of other things. But you have to be careful not to get caught up in being too cute. Another, if we look at the next slide, 45, the scatter plot. Basically, a scatter plot is something when you have to look at pairs of data. Okay? Pairs of data are very common in the business world. You may be looking, for instance, from a business standpoint, at sales in your store by the hour of the day. Everybody knows that sales are cyclical, but they're cyclical in many ways. There are days of the week where you have higher sales, obviously weekends if you're open, because people can get to the stores. There are hours of the day where sales are higher, often early morning, late night, when people are not working, or before or after work. There are seasonalities of sales. We all know that retail sales get their biggest boost around Christmas time every year. So we can use scatter plots to look at level of sales versus time of day. We can also narrow that down to what kinds of products are sold at various times of day. How many? Okay, so again, that could be related to the customer base and how it can get there, but it could also be related to other factors. So we're looking, but there needs to be a relationship between the two. On slide 45, we're looking obviously at the temperature relationship between with cricket chirps. Now, people noticed, for years that when it was colder, there generally were fewer chirps by the crickets than it was warmer. But what about that relationship? So what we're looking here is just scatter plot, and the scatter plot is just raw data, no analysis. This is what we see. This is a relatively simple scatter plot. There are some scatter plots that can get very, very complicated. And they get complicated only because you have a lot of data points. So again, you have to choose the method of your analysis that you're going to use. But the scatter plot here makes it pretty clear that the higher the temperature in general, the more the chirps. But we have a couple of data points that don't fit that. Okay, such as the 960 chirps per minute at 72 degrees compared to 900 chirps per minute at 80 degrees. Okay, so what we've got here is we see variation. This also tells us that data are not necessarily consistent, especially when we're talking about behavioral data for animals or people, right? So we can look at all of these things as merely data points, but in general, you're going to get more chirps if the temperature is higher. Okay, that makes sense? From looking at this, you'd look at it and say that. This again is a visual way of saying, okay, we've got for 8 data points. 8 data points is a small data set. But what we do is a lot of times when we're doing research or when we're doing data is we'll take small data sets and we'll plot them out somehow to see if we can see a trend that is intriguing, and then we want to get more data. So if we actually were accumulating this data in, say, 3 dozen different areas of, say, the city of Loveland, and we accumulated the data for a year, we'd have a lot more data points. And my bet is that we would see a much tighter relationship, linear relationship between temperature and chirps. But we don't necessarily. I mean, sometimes we get surprised. But this tells us where our data might take us. So small data sets can give us ideas for how to get more data to actually prove a hypothesis or disprove. There's time series graph, okay? Here we're looking at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And in a year, and obviously they've got several data points in each year. Or no, they've got one data point per year. What we don't know is if it is at the end of the year. That would be logical. Or maybe it is on June 30th, the middle of the year. End of the year, things get a little skewed in the Dow Jones because people are either taking profits or maybe doing other things, maybe holding on. And so the last day might not be the best way, even though when used to be, there were places that used to base taxes. In North Carolina, when we first lived there, they used to tax us on our income. Okay, we had to pay sales taxes and everything else, but they also taxed our accumulated assets at the end of every year. So our accumulated savings accounts, our accumulated investment accounts. So the Dow Jones Industrial Average on December 31st, or the last trading day of the year, whenever that was used to calculate what we owed the state. Now, if on that last trading day it dropped, that was good. We owed less. But if it was up, and then on January 2nd, it dropped again, we still owed what was based on the end of the year. They fortunately got enough flack on that one that they changed it. They dropped that because it was double taxation. We'd already paid taxes on that money. But they would do that. But here we have a time series graph. And again, if we look, and we're looking here only at a 47, or yeah, about a 47-year span, because it looks like it goes up to about 2007. And we're looking at the end of the year, I'm presuming end of the year, Dow Jones Industrial Average. If we look at that, we say, well, okay, 2000 to 2007 or 2006 weren't very good. Well, we know that. We remember that. All of us were around for that mess. But people make a couple of mistakes here. One is to assume that 2000 to 2007 was a bad years to be in the stock market. Not necessarily. The other is that, but the one thing we can say is that for the time period of this data, on average, every year the stock market went up. So maybe if you've been in the stock market, just left your money there from 1960 to 2007, you would have seen it grow from say $1,000 to $13,000. That's not a bad return on 47 years. Okay. On the other hand, it says nothing at all about anything else about the economy. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the joke is that economists have three rules. The Dow Jones is not the economy is number one. Number two, the Dow Jones is not the economy. And you can probably figure out from that what number three is. But it does tell us that that on average, investing in the stock market is probably worthwhile. And we also know that since 2007, it has doubled. It's gone from 12.5 to 25,000, and it's still there, even though we had a real big so-called correction in the last week and beginning of this week. It's still doubled. So if you look in the long haul, if you look on a day-to-day basis, yeah, you're going to lose money, maybe. If you look on the long haul, you're going to make money. Okay. Let's take a look at some presentation guidelines. If you have a small data set, the suggestion here, Edward Tufte is a statistician. I think he was active in the 50s and 60s. But small data sets, we have 20 values or fewer, a table is going to be useful. Graphical analysis is going to mislead you. Okay. The graphical analysis should focus on the data and not on little tricks of visual whatever to distract from looking at the data. Design features. When somebody is putting together something that really looks well designed, you still have to look at the data. Ignore the design. You have to look at the data. Don't distort the data. Remember the data about that we talked about in your text. They're talking about differential in salaries between California and Nevada. And if you start off with a graph or a y-axis that starts at 0, you're going to see a very small difference between the two. But if you start at 30,000 a year, you're going to see a very great difference. And that's all visual. That's razzle dazzle. It doesn't tell us anything. If you really look at the numbers and look at the ratio of those numbers, then it tells you a different story. Essentially, all the ink should be for the data, not creating fancy designs. And a pie chart is good for this because all of the ink, even the colors, are designed to help you look at the data. Everything about presenting data should be focused on presenting data in a neutral fashion to allow the person looking at the data to understand it. Even though sometimes you have to try to avoid using cross-hatching and slanted lines and stuff, where that comes in, these days it's not necessary because we can print everything and display everything in color. People have a problem with looking at becoming visually uncomfortable with presented with cross-hatching and slanting lines. If you look at plots where they use that, you can see what I'm talking about. Data that are one-dimensional in nature don't use volume. Remember the thing about the barrels of oil produced in the U.S. versus Japan. If we use a bar chart, obviously the difference is about a factor of 3.5 to 4. Whereas if you then use a depiction of a three-dimensional object, a barrel, and then grow each dimension by 3.5 to 4, then it looks much, much larger visually than the one that represents just the unit that we're starting with. So what we want to do is avoid that illusion of a great differential that comes merely from using graphical a drawing that is not appropriately enlarged. Area and volume. Remember that area increases by the square. So if you have twice as much being produced and you try to represent that by a box, then a box that has twice the area is going to look very different than a box that has twice the dimensions, that becomes then 4 times the area. Volume goes up by the cube. So if you've got a cube that is 1 unit on a side, the total volume of that cube is 1. If you have a cube that is 2 units on a side, the total volume goes up by 8. 2 times 2 times 2. So it's a misrepresentation of the data. And it's usually done for a very specific purpose. Advertisers are really awful about this, implying things that don't exist. Another one is using drawings of dollar bills, they say, to represent budget amounts for different years. The issue of the growth or change of a budget is not related just to drawings of dollar bills. It makes it look very, very different. He doesn't like pie charts because they waste ink on non-data components and lack appropriate scale. It depends, again, on how you construct your pie chart. I happen to think pie charts are some of the easiest way, if you are consistent with the way you construct your data. I think they're probably one of the most useful ways. Hello.
Good. Morning, Mike.
Good morning, Katie. Okay, here is an example. You've all seen this. This looks like it's taken right out of Consumer Reports, right? Where we use circles of different colors and different shadings or different fillings. Okay, it's very excellent. We've got two made up cars, Firebrand and Speedster. Okay, and we've looked at the data. It looks like, and if you look at this, which car would you buy? Yeah, engine repairs, much better. Okay, even if you segment it by the year, remember this is year model. This model here is year model. So if you look at the Firebrand in 06, everything except suspension is on the far end of good, and suspension is still good. Whereas the Speedster, you've got 3 items that are in the bad side, 2 of which are all bad. So you'd look at that and you'd say, no, I wouldn't do that. But let's take a look at some of the other data on car manufacturers. Number one, years ago, I read this study, and it also depends on the day of the week the car was manufactured and the time of day. Okay, if the car was manufactured at the beginning of the day shift, in the first 2 or 3 hours of the day shift, it was generally better made on a Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. Monday, the idea was that the workers were hung over from the weekend, and Friday they were just really ready to go home and they didn't care. So if you were looking at a car manufactured in the morning on Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, the morning part of the day shift, it was better manufactured. So you have to know much more. This is composite data. Is it useful? Yeah, it's useful. It tells me that a couple of things are going on. Both of the cars improved over the years the suspension. Okay, suspension is a lot about comfort in a car, and also about not just reliability, but the frequency of repairs. If the suspension is bad, you get a lot more vibration in the car. you get a lot more deterioration. Electrical repairs, looks like the Firebrand got their act together after 2000 and did a better job. Speedster engine repairs, yeah, it looks like they've really come a long way from 2000. So you're looking at trends. You're also looking at safety features, which really this skews it right there. The safety features in the Speedster are pretty bad. With the name Speedster, it's not being built for safety, it's being built for speed. Safety features add weight. Weight slows it down. So it depends on what you're after. If you're after a fast car with a decent transmission and a good suspension, you might want to go to the Speedster. Depends on what you're after. But these are part of it. Okay, so we have we spent some time looking at different ways of putting data together. So let's just take a look at some critical thinking and look at bad graphs, because that's really what you're going to be looking at this week, is bad analysis. Sometimes they're bad because they have errors. Okay, that happens. If you look, again, this is why you want to know what the data set was that created the graph. If you just presented with a graph, that's fine. It was like I asked, what date in the Dow Jones Industrial Average during the year did they choose? Or is it the average daily closing value of the DJI during the year? And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know what the data, they were just presented. Some are misleading. Misleading is one of the biggest things that I want you to be on the lookout for in looking at the presentation of data by graphical analysis. Ask yourself, is this misleading because they have emphasized one thing? There are some very subtle ways they can do that. They can make the print larger or bolder in the areas they want you to focus on. Or they can make the colors, they can make it very difficult to actually see what's going on in areas they don't want you to focus on. These are deliberate distortions of data, usually. So you need to be able to really look at these things. So let's look at one. Here we have a look at some political issues that, again, this is not class about politics, but politics uses surveys a lot. So we'll have to deal with some political issues. This goes back to a case that some of you may remember, the Terri Schiavo case, in which Terri Schiavo was a Florida woman who was brain dead, and there was a move in Congress to actually prevent the doctors involved in her case in Congress to stop them from removing a feeding tube from a woman who had no cerebral activity. Okay, and even some doctors in Congress looked at some of the medical data and said, well, it looks like there's cerebral activity to me. So this was a real interesting fight. I remember it well. And finally, the courts got involved and said that the feeding tube could be removed. So we looked at what the difference is between Democrats, Republicans, and independents, saying in terms of agreeing with the agreement by the court. If you look at the graph on the left, it looks like the Democrats, by a huge margin, supported removing the feeding tube. But if you look at the scale on the left of that graph, It starts at 53% and ends at 62%. And if you look at the numbers, it's pretty obvious. 54% of Republicans agreed, and 54% of independents agreed. Note that nobody's less than 50% here. But if you go and look at the graph on the right, which starts at 0% and goes to 100, the difference doesn't look near as big. So this is actually a misleading way to present data. In reality, if you want to present data and try to make a difference bigger than it looks, probably your best method is to use a table. But graphical analysis has a visual impact. The first time I looked at this, I said, oh my goodness, the Democrat. Oh, and then I looked at it and said, oh yeah, I see what's going on. And you look at the other one, and there's not that much of a visual impact. Yes, it's still the same data, 62% of Democrats, 54% of Republicans, and 54% of independents. But the first one is misleading and obviously an attack on the Democrats to try and make them look like they're extremists. Okay? So pictographic analysis, we talked about these as well. Pictographic means three-dimensional objects. There's lots of ways of looking at that. We've all seen lots of pictures. USA Today is bad about using pictures in presenting their statistics. But so is Time Magazine and Newsweek, for that matter. They all do this. We talked about that. If you double the side of a square, the area increases by the factor of 4. You double the side of the cube, it increases by a factor of 8. These can be visually stunning. So we are using this here. So let's just take a look here at some of the data being depicted in terms of annual incomes from different educational levels. And this all comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but somebody else has done this graph. First off, that big F in the middle, looks like an F, that dollar bill right in the middle, is very visually interfering with understanding the data. The bars are all the same width. You cannot apply that. You can't look at that and say, okay, no high school diploma, they still have the same educational, they've doubled their educational value. And they put all these bars, and this is just a straight data analysis. If we look at this, we've got a differential of 50% between a high school diploma and no high school diploma in the annual income. I would presume this is some form of average, maybe a median, but we're looking at a difference of 50%. But then if you look at the differential between a high school diploma and a bachelor's degree, it's almost double. And yet you don't see that from this graph. You just see that there's bigger income, but it's almost double. And then it goes up another 50% for an advanced degree. So there's really, the relationship here is very confusing, besides the fact that partial dollar bill there is just a confusing factor. Doesn't really tell us anything. What would be more appropriate would probably be one of the representations of a graph, maybe a line graph where you have high school diploma X and just go up from there. But if we take a look again at using a box, a cube, a box to do this, we've got a the box down there for 18,000, a box for 27,000. It looks like they've increased at approximately 50% in each direction. And then almost doubled it for the next one and 50% again. This is very misleading. Because of course, when you double something and put it into a box, what they've done is increased by a factor of 8 instead. Okay. So if we look all together, the value, the last box is about 4 times as tall and 4 times as wide, 4 times as deep as the first one. It looks like that the differential is 64. And clearly 18 divided into 74 is not 64. It's closer to 4. Okay. So what we have is, this is very misleading, and it does something that is potentially very dangerous. It implies that everyone should go through to get an advanced degree if they want to make this kind of money. And it looks much more than it actually is. If we look at this bar graph, this is much more representative. It is clear from here that yes, if you have an advanced degree, you're going to make a lot more, about 4 times as much. But the numbers are all there, the graphical analysis. If this were based on the volume of those cubes, this last one would be, somewhere up around the ceiling of this room. Okay. So again, this is a much more balanced view of the data. Okay. So, questions, comments? Okay. So we're going to stop that share, and we're going to go back to I'd better do this. Okay, so if we just take a look at the at what's going on, we have we've just gotten through chapter 2. I'll put up today's Zoom session sometime this afternoon. You have your assignments. Homework is assignments 1 and 1B, 1A and 1B. Assignment 1C is to start that research about looking at statistics in the possible future job or current job or whatever, or a past job you've had, and then do a series of problems out of the textbook. Okay, and remember that this paragraph on the application of statistics is really the first step in writing your LRA for this class, because it takes you, that's what you'll be writing about in that. So you have that, you have the 2 homework assignments that we needed to do for this, and we have 2 assessments. Note that assessment 1 is one in which any 20 answers will get you full credit. Assessment 2 is a little bit more like an exam. You have 2 hours, or assessment 1B rather. You have 2 hours to do the thing, so make sure that you have your 2-hour time slot to get started, because you can't repeat this. So it's basically going to be using using what we've learned today and Monday. You may use your books. These are all, you're doing these at home. They're open book. So make sure you put aside the time and be ready to do them. You can use your notes, any source of information that you have available to you. So I want you to do those as well. So Monday you can bring in your homeworks, or you can submit to the Dropbox if you wish. No, because you have to write it. Yeah, you have to write it, so you'll have to write out the answers to those questions as well. A couple of things you can do. Yeah, you can put it all in one document, or you can submit several documents. Just give them different names. If you submit a document with your paragraph and then a document with the problems, give it a different name. Otherwise, it'll erase the first one. Okay. And the different name can be it can be the same name but a different format, like an Excel spreadsheet versus a Word document. It will put them both in, and it will not erase the original. So it looks at the name and the file extension. Okay, so you can do that. Multiple submissions are always allowed. I usually look and see if you've submitted something several times, which you can do. Maybe you go through and say, "Oh, I made a mistake on my paragraph about statistics," and you want to redo it and submit it a second time. I look for the latest submission. That's my first choice. And so don't hesitate. You can do that. Okay. All right. Other things, if you have issues, you have a question, email me. I am not, during the day here, I'm on the computer a fair bit. When I'm at home, I usually will try and get on the computer a couple of times a day to see if people are asking me questions. So if I don't get right back to you, don't worry about it. I usually will get back to you, sometime during the day. All right. So another thing I urge you to do is watch for instances where people are throwing out statistics, and ask yourself what it is that they're trying to say. Now we see a lot of things these days on the internet of people who have a purpose. They're throwing out a lot of statistics. They're trying to prove their point. Be suspicious, even if you think the person is first rate. Be suspicious when they start talking fast and throwing out a large number of numbers. Be a little suspicious about what they're saying, and don't be afraid to check them. And remember that if something doesn't sound right, there's a good chance it isn't. And always check. I mean, I'm always willing to listen to people that I may not agree with in general, because if they're right, then I need to change my opinion. But I'm willing to give them a chance, and I'm willing to look. But I check. If it's important enough for me to be interested in, I'll check on it. And so I think we should all be doing that. We'd have a better view of what's actually going on. I definitely have my own political viewpoint, but I also recognize that people that ostensibly share my political viewpoint may not be right, and they may be they're not necessarily right on every topic. So, especially in politics, but in almost anything. And the idea is to make sure that you understand the issues, which means in statistics, understanding the data. Where does it come from? How is it obtained? And finally, what does it mean? Sure. Uh-huh. Oh, golly. You're right. You're right. You're right. I was. Almost time to go, but I'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Sorry about, thanks, April. Totally.
Well, I mean, there's the questions here. You have to figure out, okay, so how am I supposed to write this down on here on the computer screen? I'm just going to write it down on the computer screen. You have to work with it. Oh, that's cool. Do I have a piece of paper to work with? I know we can put a minute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Anyway, have a good weekend. And we'll see you on Monday morning, bright and early, for starting off your week with statistics. Doesn't that sound like fun?